Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tochi. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. They said love is blind, but in Victory's case, it could see clearer than daylight. From the moment she met Daniel Edu at a youth conference in Yaba, her heart knew peace. He was quiet yet confident, the kind of man whose smile could calm a storm. She was radiant, with laughter that rolled like soft thunder after rain. Their love grew not in fairy tale silence but through Lagos noise, honking buses, impatient drivers, the chaos of survival that wrapped the city like a stubborn fog. Together, they built something that felt unshakable. In Suralire, where they lived, Victory's voice could often be heard from the balcony calling Daniel in mock annoyance when he came home late. Their neighbors envied the warmth between them. People said they were the kind of couple whose shadows walked hand in hand. Daniel worked as a software engineer at a firm in Victoria Island, and Victory ran a small interior design business from home. Life wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that was enough. When evening came, they would sit on their balcony and talk about dreams, the kind that make you believe tomorrow will be kinder. Victory would rest her head on his shoulder, whispering, "If love were a place, Daniel, I'd never want to travel out." He'd chuckle, that deep, quiet laughter that made her chest ache in the sweetest way. In those moments, even the city seemed to pause, like Lagos itself understood that sometimes love deserves a little silence. But peace in Lagos has wings. It never stays too long in one place. It began like a careless whisper, the cough that Daniel brushed off with a smile. He said it was stress, just the usual Lagos walla, but Victory felt a shadow growing between them. Every night she would watch him struggle to breathe and convince herself it was nothing serious. She boiled ginger, honey, lemon, everything her grandmother ever taught her, but nothing worked. Hospitals came and went like passing clouds. Doctors said different things. Some shrugged, some smiled with pity. Victory started to pray like her life depended on it. "God, please not him," she'd mutter at 3 a.m., kneeling beside his bed, her tears blending with the night's silence. Days turned into weeks, and Daniel grew weaker. The sparkle that once lit his eyes dimmed like a bulb losing power. Still, he smiled for her, still whispered that everything would be fine. One quiet dawn, when the sky was barely awake, Victory reached out to hold his hand, but it was cold, too cold, like the world had gone still. Her scream shattered the morning. It rose above the rooftops and crashed into every window on the street. Neighbors ran in, confused, frightened. The love that once filled their home had turned to echo. Daniel was gone. Just like that, gone. The funeral came like a bad dream that refused to end. The compound overflowed with people wearing faces soaked in sympathy, their mouths full of empty words. Victory moved through them like a ghost, her eyes swollen but dry. Tears had betrayed her too early, now they refused to come. Mama Ruth, her mother-in-law, held her close, murmuring, "Take heart, my daughter, God knows best." Those words felt like stones on her chest. She nodded, but inside, something was breaking slowly, piece by piece. When the priest said, "Dust to dust," Victory's knees trembled. Daniel's coffin disappeared into the earth, and with it went the life she knew. The next few days blurred. The house that once hummed with laughter now breathed only silence. Every corner reminded her of him, the toothbrush by the sink, the shirt he wore last, the half-written grocery list on the fridge. At night, she found herself setting his plate at dinner out of habit. Sometimes she swore she could still hear him call her name from the corridor. Grief was no longer something she felt, it was something she lived in like air. Lagos kept moving as it always did, indifferent to her pain. Buses roared, traders shouted, life continued. But for Victory, the world had gone still, like the city had forgotten her address. When the condolence visits ended, reality crept in quietly, like water through cracked walls. Bills began to pile up, Daniel's salary stopped coming. The relatives who once promised support started giving excuses. Victory sat alone on the balcony one night, looking at the city lights that blinked like fading stars. She thought about how people say time heals, but no one warns you how cruel the waiting feels. Every morning she forced herself to get out of bed, to breathe, to exist. She would open the curtains and tell herself, "He wouldn't want me to give up." But beneath that courage lived a raw ache. The nights were the hardest. That was when memory became louder than reason. Some nights, she'd wake up thinking he was beside her, only to reach out and touch emptiness. She wondered if love could haunt a house. Still, she refused to leave. She told herself the walls still remembered his laughter. Leaving would mean erasing him completely. And so she stayed, in that house where love once bloomed like morning flowers but now wilted in quiet darkness. The days after Daniel's burial stretched like slow, endless hours, each one heavy with the weight of things left unsaid. Victory began to feel like a visitor in her own life. The world outside her door had resumed its rhythm, but inside, everything remained frozen in that single moment when Daniel's heart stopped. The condolence banners had faded, the flowers withered, and the once busy compound of the Idis grew quiet, almost suffocating. At first, Mama Ruth seemed to cling to her, calling her my daughter with tenderness. She would sit with Victory in the living room, both women staring into nothing, their silence filled with memories neither dared to speak. Sometimes Mama Ruth's eyes softened with pity, but sometimes, when she thought Victory wasn't looking, they hardened with something darker, something Victory couldn't yet name. She told herself it was grief, that maybe pain made people strange. The air in the house grew thicker each day, carrying whispers of things unsaid. Samson, Daniel's older brother, began spending more time around, pacing the compound with an air of authority. He spoke in clipped tones, as if he had suddenly become the head of the house. When Victory tried to discuss Daniel's unfinished projects or the children's school fees, Samson brushed her off with a careless wave. "We will handle it," he said. His words were light, but his tone carried a new sharpness, a quiet claim over everything Daniel left behind. Victory noticed the small changes first. The way Samson took Daniel's wristwatch and began wearing it, how Mama Ruth suddenly requested for the house documents for record purposes. She didn't question it at first. Her mind was too clouded by sorrow. But one afternoon, while arranging Daniel's files, she discovered that some of the property papers were missing. Her heart raced. She went straight to Samson, hoping it was just a misunderstanding. He didn't deny it. Instead, he looked at her with a smug calm that chilled her. "You don't understand, Victory," he said, leaning back in the chair like a man already in control. "These things belong to the Ida family. Daniel may be gone, but his bloodline remains. We have to protect what's ours." She was speechless. "What's yours?" she whispered. "Daniel and I built everything together." Samson smirked, tilting his head. "You're just his wife. We're his blood." The words sliced through her like broken glass. From that day, the atmosphere in the house changed completely. The same family who once embraced her with open arms now looked at her as though she were an intruder. Mama Ruth became distant, her words wrapped in cold politeness. Conversations ended when Victory entered a room. Even the household staff avoided her gaze. The warmth that had once filled the Ida home had turned into ice. Weeks turned into months, and the silence between them grew poisonous. One night, Victory overheard Samson on the phone in the veranda. His voice was low but firm. "We'll transfer the ownership next week. She won't have access to anything once it's done." Her pulse quickened. That night, she barely slept. By morning, she confronted Mama Ruth. "Why are you letting this happen?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mama Ruth avoided her eyes, fingers tightening around her wrapper. "You're young," she said softly. "You'll start again. Daniel is gone, and things have changed." The words stung more than a slap. Victory realized then that grief had divided them. Where love once lived, suspicion had taken root. Later that day, she returned home from the market to find the locks on the gate changed. Confused, she knocked for minutes before Samson appeared, arms folded. "You can't come in," he said bluntly. "This is a family matter now." She stared at him, disbelief choking her. "Family? I'm Daniel's wife." Samson's face hardened. "You were his wife," he corrected. "Now please leave." The sound of that gate slamming shut echoed in her chest like a verdict. Her children's cries came faintly from inside, muffled by the walls that once sheltered her love. She begged, pleaded, pounded on the gate until her hands ached, but no one opened. Lagos traffic hummed in the distance, indifferent to her heartbreak. She sank to the ground, belly heavy with child, tears mixing with the dust. That night, Victory found herself sitting by the roadside in front of the house that used to be her world. The streetlights flickered above, throwing long, broken shadows across her face. The city roared around her, its noise mocking her pain. She could hear neighbors whispering, feel their eyes on her, but no one came close. Pity is loud, but help is always silent. She spent hours staring at the gate, hoping it would open, that someone inside would remember her kindness, her laughter, the way she once filled that house with joy. But no door opened. Her mind raced with memories. Daniel's hand on hers, the nights they spent dreaming of their children's future, the promises they made under the city's restless moon. Everything felt like smoke slipping through her fingers. When dawn came, Victory dragged herself to her feet and walked toward the main road, one hand on her swollen belly, the other wiping tears she no longer had strength to shed. Each step felt heavier than the last. The city seemed to watch her, indifferent but alive. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stay there. Behind her, the Ida house stood tall and silent, its windows reflecting the morning light like eyes that refused to blink. And as the sun rose over Lagos, Victory made a silent vow. She might have lost her home, her safety, her peace, but she would not lose her children, and she would not lose herself. Lagos has a way of swallowing pain whole. It doesn't wait for anyone to heal. The morning Victory walked away from the Ida compound, the city seemed to hum with cruel irony. Hawkers shouting prices, Danfo buses honking, lovers arguing by street corners. Life was happening in full color, while hers had turned gray. She found herself in a rundown part of Ajigunle, drawn there by a distant cousin who offered her a temporary place. The room she got was barely larger than a kitchen, its single window cracked and covered with old newspapers to block the rain. She sat on the edge of the bed, looking at the peeling walls, feeling the weight of her unborn child pressing against her ribs. It wasn't just pregnancy she carried, it was betrayal, grief, and a loneliness that felt endless. She tried to call Samson several times, but his number stopped connecting. Mama Ruth didn't answer either. Each ring was like a slap from fate, a reminder that she had been erased from the family she once called her own. Still, she refused to crumble. Every morning, she washed her face, wrapped her head tie tight, and walked to the roadside to sell akara and pap. The air smelled of engine oil and sweat, but she endured it because her survival depended on it. People passed by without seeing her pain. In Lagos, everyone was too busy fighting their own battles. Yet, every night, as she lay on her thin mattress, she would whisper to her belly, "You'll come into this world strong, my baby. You'll see peace where I didn't." Her body was present, but her spirit wandered toward the past. She often thought about Daniel's laughter, and how it once filled the house like morning music. Now that laughter was only an echo trapped inside her. The nights were her worst enemy. She'd lie awake, listening to the rain tapping on the roof, wondering if her children were sleeping well or crying for her. Sometimes she imagined Mama Ruth telling them lies, stories that painted her as a selfish woman who abandoned them. The thought made her heart clench. One afternoon, she walked all the way to the old neighborhood, standing across from the Ida gate just to catch a glimpse of her children. She saw them playing in the yard, their tiny figures moving like dream shadows behind the fence. Her throat tightened, tears stung her eyes, but she didn't call out. Samson's car was parked nearby. She couldn't risk a scene. So she stood there in silence, letting her tears fall onto the dusty pavement, whispering promises to the wind. A passerby stopped to ask if she was lost, but she simply shook her head and walked away. Her feet were blistered by the time she got back to Ajigunle, yet her heart felt even more bruised. That night, as thunder rolled above, Victory decided she had taken enough blows from silence. The next morning, she visited a local police station in Apapa, hoping to report her children missing, but the officer on duty only laughed dryly. "Madam, na family matter be this. Go settle am for house," he said without looking up from his newspaper. She left, humiliated but not defeated. Something inside her was beginning to harden, like iron left too long in fire. The weeks that followed tested her strength in ways she could never have imagined. Her pregnancy grew heavier, and so did the struggle to keep food on her table. Some nights she went to bed hungry, other nights she felt her baby kick as if reminding her to hold on. She met a woman named Aisha, a widowed tailor living 2 rooms away, who became her first true friend in months. Aisha had eyes that carried stories of her own battles. They would sit outside in the evenings, sewing and talking while the neighborhood buzzed with noise. "You see, my sister," Aisha once said, "grief doesn't kill, it just rearranges your heart." Victory smiled faintly at that, her fingers tightening around her thread. The words lingered long after. She began saving the little she made, keeping her dream alive like a hidden ember. She told herself she would fight for her children no matter how long it took. She started visiting the court library in Ikeja on her off days, reading about inheritance laws, women's rights, anything that could help her understand her standing. The clerks would watch her curiously as she took notes in her small book. They didn't know this was how she breathed now, through learning, through planning, through hope. Each line she read became a quiet weapon sharpening inside her. She wasn't just a widow anymore. She was a mother learning to fight with words instead of tears. Then came the evening that changed everything. She returned from her stall to find a man waiting outside her room, a courier from the court. He handed her a brown envelope, stamped with an official seal. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a court summons. Samson had filed a suit claiming ownership of Daniel's property, accusing her of attempting to illegally occupy and claim what belonged to the Eda family. For a moment, the room spun. She sank into her chair, the paper shaking in her hands. Anger rose in her chest like wildfire, but beneath it was fear, raw and deep. She felt betrayed all over again, yet this time, something inside her refused to collapse. She placed the letter on the table, stared at it for a long time, and whispered to herself, "So this is the fight they want." Outside, Lagos roared with traffic and voices, the smell of roasted corn drifting through the air. She looked through the cracked window at the city lights and felt something shift inside her. The fear that once held her captive began to loosen its grip. If Samson thought she would surrender quietly, he didn't know her heart. She straightened her shoulders, her breath steady, her resolve fierce. She had been thrown out, mocked, forgotten, but she wasn't done. Not yet. The morning after the court letter arrived, Victory woke up before dawn. The city was still half asleep, its noise distant, like the hum of a tired machine. She sat by the small window, staring into the quiet street, her thoughts running faster than the early Danfo buses. The air was heavy, thick with moisture and uncertainty. She traced the edges of the court letter again and again, as if touching it would reveal some hidden meaning. The paper had become more than just a summons. It was a declaration of war. She had spent months mourning, begging, surviving. Now the time for tears was over. Her belly had grown rounder, and every kick from her unborn child reminded her she wasn't fighting just for herself anymore. She dressed simply that morning, tying a faded scarf around her head. As she stepped outside, the sky threatened rain, and a gust of wind blew dust across the street. She took it as a sign. Storms were coming, but she was ready to walk through them. On her way to the courthouse in Acadia, the bus ride felt endless. Faces blurred beside her. Everyone looked busy, tired, focused on their own battles. Lagos never cared who was breaking inside. It kept moving, loud and alive. By the time she reached the courthouse, her hands were trembling, but not from fear, rather from a nervous kind of courage. Inside, the courthouse smelled of paper, sweat, and tension. The waiting area buzzed with voices. Lawyers in sharp suits, clients whispering anxiously, clerks shuffling files. Victory felt small, invisible almost, but she held her chin high. When Samson walked in, he looked different, his clothes finer, his face smug, confidence dripping from every gesture. He barely glanced at her, as if she were just another obstacle in his path. His lawyer, a tall man with glasses and a cold smile, stood beside him. When they passed her, she heard Samson mutter something under his breath and laugh. Victory clenched her fists, forcing herself not to respond. She sat at the far end of the bench, her hand resting protectively on her belly. Minutes turned into hours before the clerk finally called her name. When she stepped forward, her knees trembled slightly, but she refused to show weakness. The courtroom was colder than she expected, its walls high and pale, the judge seated above like a stern god. The case was called, and Samson's lawyer began his speech, words rolling smoothly like oil. He painted Victory as an opportunist, a woman trying to steal what didn't belong to her. Each word hit her like a slap, but she didn't flinch. When it was her turn to speak, her voice shook at first, but as she continued, strength rose in her like a tide. She told her story plainly, how she and Daniel had built everything together, how love had turned to ashes, how she was being stripped of everything she had left. The courtroom fell silent for a moment when she finished. Even the judge looked at her longer than usual, as though weighing not just her words, but her pain. The case dragged on for weeks. Every hearing drained her, but she showed up, even on days when her legs ached and her belly felt too heavy to carry. Some days she had to borrow money for transport. Other days she walked halfway across the city, her determination lighting the road ahead. The gossip in court corridors didn't spare her. People whispered, some out of pity, some out of disbelief that she dared to stand against such a powerful family. Yet each night, as she returned to her small room in Ajigunal, she would sit quietly, whispering prayers into the humid air, asking for strength and justice. Aisha, her friend, stayed by her side, mending her torn clothes, cooking when she was too weak to stand. "Courage doesn't mean you're not afraid," Aisha told her one night, stirring a pot of rice over a small stove. It means you show up even when fear is louder than faith. Victory smiled faintly, her eyes wet. Those words became her anchor. The city outside roared with life, but she lived each day moment by moment, her hope the only constant thing that refused to die. Every time she thought she was at her limit, she would remember her children's faces, and the fire inside her would flare again. The hearings went on, each one testing her patience, but she stood firm, her voice steady, her truth unwavering. She was learning to fight in a world that had taught her to bow. Then came the day the verdict was finally announced. The courtroom was crowded, the air thick with whispers and anticipation. Victory sat still, her hands folded over her lap, her breath uneven. Samson sat across from her, his expression calm but confident, his lawyer flipping through papers like the result was already known. When the judge began to speak, his voice was slow, deliberate. He recounted the evidence, the testimonies, the inconsistencies in Samson's claims. Each word built like a drumbeat in Victory's chest. Then came the sentence that would change everything. The property legally belonged to Daniel's wife and children, and the defendants were ordered to return the children to their mother immediately. The sound that left her lips wasn't quite a sob, and not quite a laugh. It was something in between, raw and trembling. Samson's face fell, his arrogance melting into shock. Mama Ruth, seated behind him, covered her face with both hands. Victory didn't move for a moment. She just sat there, tears streaming freely, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it echo. When she finally stood, her steps were light, almost unsteady. The judge's voice faded into the background. All she could see were the faces of her children waiting for her. For the first time in months, she smiled, not out of pride but relief. The fight was over, and she had survived. The day she got her children back was one the sky itself seemed to remember. Clouds hung low over Lagos, restless with promise. Victory stood at the courthouse gate, her palms trembling slightly as she waited. Then she saw them, two small figures running toward her, their voices breaking through the noise of the city like sunlight cutting through mist. Her heart stuttered. Her knees gave way before she even realized she was kneeling. The children clung to her, their tiny arms wrapping around her neck, their tears mixing with hers. The smell of their hair, the warmth of their bodies, it all came back to her in a rush so overwhelming she could barely breathe. 1,000 sleepless nights folded into that single moment. She pulled back just enough to look at them, memorizing every detail of their faces, as if afraid they might vanish again. The courthouse crowd blurred around them. Strangers watched silently, some smiling, some wiping their eyes, but Victory saw only her children. "We're together now," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Nobody will ever take you away again." The younger one nodded, confused but comforted by the firmness in her mother's tone. The older child simply buried her face in Victory's shoulder and whispered, "I knew you would come." That was the moment the city seemed to pause, just for her. No noise, no chaos, only the sound of 3 hearts beating as one. They went home that evening in a taxi that rattled like an old drum, but to Victory, it felt like a chariot of triumph. The driver glanced at her through the rearview mirror and smiled faintly, perhaps recognizing something sacred in the reunion behind him. When they reached the small compound in Ajigunle, the children looked around curiously, their eyes wide. The place was far smaller than the home they once knew, but to Victory, it was paradise regained. She had cleaned the room earlier, laid out their old clothes, and even cooked rice, saving it for the moment she dreamt about for months. They ate together that night, sitting cross-legged on the floor, the meal simple but rich with meaning. Between bites, the children chattered endlessly, stories about school, about Grandma's house, about the things they missed. Victory listened, laughing softly, nodding, her eyes glistening but warm. Every word healed something inside her that grief had broken. When they finally fell asleep beside her, their bodies curled like question marks seeking comfort, she watched them with a kind of awe. Sleep refused to come easily that night. Her mind drifted back to Daniel, their first home, their laughter, his promise to protect them always. She wondered if, wherever he was, he could see what she had done, how hard she had fought. "I kept them safe," she whispered into the dark, her fingers brushing the sleeping children's hair. "I kept your promise." The night answered with the hum of distant traffic, and Victory closed her eyes, letting peace wash over her slowly. The next morning brought the kind of sunshine Lagos rarely offered, soft, golden, forgiving. Victory woke early, cooked breakfast, and watched her children chase each other around the small yard. For the first time in what felt like forever, she laughed freely. The sound startled even her. It was deep, unguarded, almost foreign after months of silence. Aisha came over, smiling wide. "Ah, see joy on your face," she teased. placing her hands on her hips. If happiness was a person, not you. Victory grinned shyly, stirring the pot on her small stove. God has done it, my sister, she said, her tone humble but full of wonder. They talked as the children played, the city coming alive around them. Buses rumbled in the distance, the scent of roasted plantain floated from the roadside, and someone nearby sang an old gospel song off-key. Everything felt ordinary, yet extraordinary. Victory had learned to appreciate ordinary days. The quiet ones without heartbreak, without noise, just the rhythm of life breathing steadily again. As noon approached, she took her children out to a small market nearby. People stared, some recognizing her from her long ordeal, their eyes carrying both admiration and guilt. Victory walked with her head high. The whispers no longer mattered. She had been tested in fire, and she had come out whole. That evening, after the children had fallen asleep, Victory stepped outside and stood under the open sky. The air smelled of rain, fresh and alive. She closed her eyes, listening to the distant roll of thunder. The city lights flickered like stars too stubborn to fade. For months, she had lived through pain so deep it threatened to erase her, but now she felt something stirring within, a calm strength that came from survival itself. She realized she didn't need the approval of the Idas, nor the pity of strangers. Her worth wasn't tied to anyone's acceptance. She looked at her small home, the flickering candlelight inside, the gentle breathing of her children, and knew she had everything that mattered. When the first drops of rain began to fall, she didn't move. She tilted her head back and let them touch her face, cool and cleansing. Somewhere deep in her heart, she heard Daniel's voice again, not as memory but as presence. "You did well," it seemed to say. Victory smiled through the rain. "We'll be all right," she whispered, her words carried away by the wind. The rain poured harder, washing the dust off the city, washing the pain off her soul. And beneath that falling sky, Victory stood tall, no longer broken, no longer afraid, just a woman who had walked through fire and learned to dance in the rain. The months that followed passed like chapters in a book she had once feared to open. Lagos, in all its chaos and beauty, wrapped itself around her life once again, this time not as an enemy, but as a mirror reflecting how far she had come. Victory had moved to a small flat in Lekki Phase 2, modest but bright, the kind of place that smelled of second chances. The walls were newly painted, the curtains white, the air clean. Each morning, she woke before dawn, listened to her children breathing softly, and thanked God for peace. It was the kind of peace that didn't announce itself. It whispered, subtle but sure, like waves brushing a quiet shore. She began designing again, slowly rebuilding her business from scratch. Clients came through referrals, drawn to her sincerity and creativity. There was something about the way she arranged colors, the way she turned small spaces into sanctuaries, that spoke of endurance. People didn't know her story, and she didn't tell it. Pain had shaped her, yes, but she no longer carried it as a banner. Lagos mornings greeted her now with open palms instead of clenched fists. She had learned that survival was not about forgetting what broke you. It was about learning how to breathe in the same space where you once suffocated. One quiet afternoon, she visited Daniel's grave for the first time since the court ruling. The cemetery sat on the outskirts of Yaba, where the city noise softened into whispers. She brought flowers, simple white lilies, and stood there for a long time, saying nothing. The breeze was gentle, carrying the faint smell of wet soil and old prayers. She traced his name on the tombstone with her fingertips, her heart steady. "You were right," she murmured, her voice soft but firm. "Love doesn't end. It just changes shape." The words floated into the air and vanished. There was no bitterness left in her, only gratitude that she had known him, that his memory had carried her through the storm. Before leaving, she looked up at the sky. It was overcast, but somehow bright. On her way home, she stopped by a roadside stall and bought Puff Puff for her children, smiling as the oil stained her fingers. Life had returned to simplicity, and she found beauty in that. The journey had taught her that strength didn't always roar. Sometimes, it simply endured quietly. As the weeks rolled into months, her children began to thrive again. Their laughter filled the flat like sunlight filtering through dusty windows. They went to school nearby, and every afternoon, Victory waited by the gate to walk them home. The bond between them deepened, no longer just love, but a quiet understanding born from shared loss. Sometimes, the older one would ask about their father, and Victory would smile gently, telling them stories of Daniel's humor, his patience, the way he once carried both children on his shoulders at the beach. Those stories became bedtime rituals, small pieces of memory stitched into their nights. Aisha still visited often, now more like family than friend. The two women would sit outside in the evenings, sipping malt and watching the neighborhood lights flicker on. "You've come far, my sister," Aisha said one night, her tone filled with admiration. Victory smiled, eyes distant. "God carried me when I couldn't walk," she replied simply. And truly he had. The pain that once defined her now lived quietly in the corners of her heart, no longer sharp, just a reminder of who she had become. The last rain of the season came on a Sunday evening. The clouds gathered over the city like a choir preparing to sing. Victory stood by her balcony, watching as the first drops splashed against the pavement below. The air smelled of renewal, rich and clean. Her children laughed behind her, running around the living room, their joy echoing off the walls. She closed her eyes, feeling the rain's rhythm sync with her heartbeat. It was strange, she thought, how life could rebuild itself after being shattered. How the same city that once broke her could now hold her so tenderly. She stepped outside, letting the rain soak her dress, her face, her hair. Neighbors might have thought her mad, but she didn't care. Each drop felt like a blessing. Each gust of wind carried away another layer of sorrow. The thunder rolled gently above, like applause from unseen hands. When her children ran out to join her, she laughed, a full, open laugh that carried no pain. For the first time in years, she felt whole. The rain no longer frightened her. It reminded her that even storms can be beautiful when they pass. And as the evening sky darkened, Victory stood beneath it, not as a woman broken by life, but as one remade by it, proof that sometimes, after the heaviest rain, the earth smells sweetest. Life will not always go the way we plan. Sometimes the people we trust most will break us, and sometimes storms will come when we least expect them. But remember this, no matter how heavy the rain falls, it doesn't last forever. What truly matters is what you do while it's falling. Don't let pain bury you, let it teach you. Don't let betrayal define you, let it refine you. When people turn their backs, face the future. And when the world says you can't, whisper quietly, "Watch me." You may bend, but you will not break. You may cry, but you will rise again. Because strength is not the absence of pain, it's the decision to keep standing after it. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for the lives of everyone listening right now. For those who are hurting, let peace find them. For those who are weary, renew their strength. For those standing in the middle of their storm, remind them that you are still in control. Teach every heart to forgive, to heal, and to rebuild. Bless the hands that work, the dreams that wait, and the faith that refuses to die. Replace every tear with laughter, every loss with restoration, and every disappointment with divine favor. May your grace speak louder than every pain they've known, and may victory follow them wherever they go. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.